The social structure of the medieval era, which spans the time 400 to 1400. It's 1,000 years of very little social progress or change that stands between the Roman and Renaissance eras. And both the Roman and the Renaissance were later considered by historians to be far more civilized than the medieval period, which is also sometimes known as the Dark Ages, because the Renaissance and Roman eras were really defined by widespread literacy and education, class equality, an emphasis on culture and the arts, a more centralized government, and relatively long periods of peace. By contrast, the medieval era or the Dark Ages, was far more decentralized, with various landowners or nobility and kings kind of constantly fighting for dominance and power and control. So for the average person who at this time was a poor peasant living off the land, there was little outside of the church to provide any type of culture or break from the everyday toils of survival. In addition, the medieval era grew out of the ashes of the Roman Empire, which ended in violent invasions from Germanic tribes. So for someone living among these ruins, who was also at that time facing the daily threat of invasion, illness, starvation, the need to scrap out a survival, living among these ruins and seeing them around must have felt something like the end of the world, or the end of a world had happened, and they'd somehow survived it. They would have seen evidence of civilization all around them. The Romans had running water, they had libraries, theaters, roads, infrastructure of all kinds. But for the peasants of the medieval period, there would have been little understanding what these structures even were, and certainly they would have had no way to use or maintain them. So as the Roman Empire fell piece by piece, and in some cases was salvaged for building materials, medieval society coalesced into what is called a medieval manor, which could range in size from a single village to a larger group of villages, which were often fortified, and which were under the rule of a single landowner or lord. Life on the manor was divided into a very strict class structure. There were those who ruled, those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked the land. Outside of the church, there was little opportunity to change your social class, and those at the bottom, the peasants or the serfs, were the greatest in number, but had very few personal rights. Warring kings rule the medieval era, and as they gain land, they are not able to guard or govern all of it. So they put members of the nobility in charge of certain regions of their land. And within these areas, which are called manors, the lord is basically the governing body. And can train an army, allocate land and resources, and function in a fairly autonomous way. However, if the lord is called upon by the king, he is expected to dedicate all of his resources to the king's cause, which of course is usually some sort of battle for the purpose of acquiring more land. Land produces food and wealth, and so the more land that the king has, the better. So in turn, the lord allocates part of his land to lesser social classes, such as the warring class, which is the knight, and then the lowest class, which is the serf. So a medieval serf is essentially part of the lord's property. He is a slave. A medieval serf might have enjoyed some level of daily autonomy, but they were indentured to the lord and were required to pay heavy taxes, work the lord's land, and obey whatever laws, arbitrary or not, that the master would have required. In exchange, the serf might enjoy relative safety within the confines of the manor, in that the knights or the warring class would protect them, along with the rest of the lord's holdings in the case of an invasion. This social structure is known as the feudal system. Every member of this system is beholden to someone above them, except for, of course, the king. Now, while the king is technically autonomous, he's also a member of the Catholic Church. Therefore, he is subject to the edicts of the Pope and the clergy. In this way, the church plays an important role in medieval politics. In addition, everyone is required to tithe 10% to the church, which in turn then, of course, amasses a great amount of wealth in the medieval period. And this is evidenced by the Gothic cathedrals, which you can still see all over Europe today. By the end of the medieval period, the church had erected a number of these massive, impressive structures. The most famous is in Notre Dame in Paris. even by modern standards, they are imposing and overwhelming to see. I've visited both Notre Dame and I've seen the cathedral in Reims, France, and I can tell you that they're very intimidating, even for a modern eye. And I can show you this picture that I took at the Reims Cathedral, and you can see the people in the doorway and how small they are relative to the entire structure. You can imagine what it would have been like for a medieval serf, a peasant who lives in a hut and lives with his own animals in that hut to keep warm, to have seen a structure like this. It is certainly a very strong symbol for the role of the church in medieval culture. So none of the social classes of the medieval culture, from the king down to the lowliest serf, was likely to have had any sort of education. Almost everyone was illiterate. Governing was seen as primarily based on the acquisition of lands through warfare, so kings didn't see any need or benefit from education or learning to read, learning about music or the arts or any sort of culture, because it did not really contribute to their ultimate goal of land acquisition. So any form of art or culture or education which takes place within this period takes place solely within the church, which was really an oasis of learning and education. And this was a central focus of the daily lives of the clergy. There was no printing technology in this period, so all books had to be hand copied. Monks spent hours, days, months, or even years preserving knowledge in the form of an illuminated manuscript. And these are hand-copied texts which are embellished by meticulous and beautiful works of art that depict everything from daily life to biblical stories. And it is believed that the purpose of illuminating the manuscript was a way of showing the importance of the content of the book to a population that couldn't read it. So this possibly was a pathway for helping someone who couldn't read to understand what was contained in the text. So very similarly, art of the period makes high use of symbolism. It was believed that symbolism was a means of providing a connection to God, even in the case where the viewer might not be capable of understanding or interpreting the symbol. Images and symbols were therefore seen to possess important powers to create, express, and communicate divinity. Medieval music functions much in the same way. The text, which is generally in Latin, and no one outside of the church in this period would have been able to understand it, usually contains important symbolic features which were thought to elevate the words being sung to a higher or sacred level. For example, passages were often repeated 3 times to represent the Trinity. In general, the medieval mind did not see music as a form of personal expression or creativity. Remember, all art and culture is geared toward the church and its symbolism. Therefore, the job of the musician was to create something balanced and beautiful, which evoked divinity through the proper use of elements and structure. Think of this as being somewhat like the Gothic Cathedral, which is both beautiful and precise and awe-inspiring, but it's also very impersonal. That a medieval musician was a scholar. The idea of artistry wasn't really factored into the process yet. By the latter part of the medieval era, the social structure began to lighten somewhat, more roads were built, a larger middle class emerged, and the grip of the church loosened somewhat, so that music outside of the church also began to become popular. Traveling musicians called jongleurs, trouvères, or troubadours traveled from place to place singing simple songs focused on the topic of love or victorious battles. Dancing also emerged as a byproduct of these songs, and music outside of the church, also called secular music, set the stage for much of the music of the Renaissance era which was to follow.